Hi, and welcome to this presentation that is the second in a series that looks at grief and loss. My name is Cindy Rowe, and I'm an MSW student at Marywood University's School of Social Work, and this lecture will cover the different factors that influence how grief is felt and expressed. To start off our discussion on the different factors that influence how people may grieve the loss of their loved one, let's first review the tasks of mourning, which are accepting the reality of the loss, processing the emotional pain involved, adjusting to a life without the person who died, and incorporating memories of them into life. It's always important to remember that grief is like a bundle of emotions that are fed by a bundle of factors. Warden cautions us to be aware of the temptation to think too simplistically about the causes and effects of grief when we're reading research on the subject. If you think back to research methods class, you'll remember how good research questions are very specific as to the relationships they intend to examine. To illustrate this point, Warden uses the example of a study that might look at the effects of a sudden traumatic death on the development of depressive symptoms in the grieving person. While the findings of such a study might be really helpful by providing new insights and building on the body of knowledge, it's vital to remember, though, that a whole host of other mediators, in addition to the traumatic nature of a loved one's death, will also impact whether or not a grief-strict person will develop depression. The questions of the length of time grieving takes and when it's finished aren't easily answered because grieving is, again, such a personal process. While the belief of some researchers, such as Lindemann, proposed that grieving should only take a short amount of time, some of the literature suggests that a major sign that a person is nearing completion of the grief process is when they feel less emotional pain when they think about their loved one. For some, this can be about a year after the person died. For others, it could be a little longer. It's also important that the bereft be made aware that the completion of the grief process doesn't mean that they will revert back to exactly the way they were before the death occurred. Integrating the loss into one's life means that the grieving person will be forever changed, and they will always carry with them memories of their loved one. Another key point to remember is that a person's grief can be re-triggered by many different things, such as birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, or by seeing pictures or objects of the deceased. To begin with what is perhaps the most obvious, the nature of the relationship between the grieving person and the person who died is one of the strongest predictors of grief. The death of a parent, for example, will likely be grieved much more intensely than the death of a family friend because of the difference in the type and strength of the relationship bonds. Generally, the closer the grieving person was to the deceased, the more intense grief will likely be. This closeness can also relate to the emotional security the deceased loved one offered the bereft person. The sense of stability and emotional well-being that each partner feels in a happy marriage, for example, can crumble for the surviving spouse after the loss of their life partner. Particularly for those whose roles in this marriage strongly defined who they are as a person, the loss of their spouse can trigger a personal identity crisis when the grieving person is dealing with task 3, or the building of a new life and a new identity as a person who is now completely on their own. Relatedly, facing life independently can be difficult for the widow or widower who suddenly finds themselves unable to manage such things as their finances, maintenance on their home, or some aspects of their self-care because they were so strongly dependent on their deceased spouse to meet those needs. Additionally, the degree of negative feelings about the deceased also impact one's feelings of grief. While all relationships involve some positive and negative emotions, feelings of guilt, anger, and resentment can manifest in a person's grief if the relationship they had with the deceased person was overall more tenuous and tension-filled. Such relationships that are fraught with conflict can also increase the likelihood of these feelings for the bereft due to the unfinished business regarding these conflicts that were never resolved when that person was still alive. This will be covered in the section covering grief in adulthood in more depth, since it's particularly relevant to situations for adults, particularly in families that have some sort of estrangement going on in their family dynamic. A large body of empirical evidence suggests that grief over a sudden death, particularly for children and adolescents, is more difficult than grieving the loss of a loved one due to a prolonged death. Findings from the Harvard Child Bereavement Study, for example, indicate that deaths that were sudden negatively impacted both the overall adjustment to the loss for the child as well as for the grieving and the loss for the entire family. The suddenness of violent deaths also pose challenges to grieving that can lead to complicated mourning, which is a state of grief that severely and pathologically interferes with one's ability to function. Not only can such deaths contribute to the mourner's self-blame and their examination of the things they feel that they could have done to prevent the person's death, which in turn challenges their ability to process painful feelings, they also call into question their assumptions about the fairness of life and their view of the world as a safe place, which relates back to task 3 of the grieving process. This shattering of one's worldview is also particularly troublesome for children and teens grieving the death of a parent, since their sense of safety and security is so closely tied to their parents. Lastly, deaths that carry a lot of stigma, such as suicides, may prevent the bereft from getting support from their social circle due to the fact that other people might not know what to say or what to do, or the grieving person might not seek out that support from others because they might feel ashamed or embarrassed that their loved one died that way. Another factor in the grief process has to do with the way a grieving person managed grieving previous losses in the past and whether or not there is any unresolved grief. According to the literature, those with a history of depression were found to be at greater risk of major depression occurring in bereavement. And since depression interferes with one's ability to fully grieve losses to begin with, the likelihood of the bereft person carrying forward unresolved grief increases as well. So it can become like a vicious cycle. It's believed that any gender differences in grieving are attributable more to socialization than to genetics. While research findings on the impact of gender on grief are inconclusive, some researchers suggest that women tend to approach grief in a more emotional manner, which again can be explained by the way women are socialized to be more nurturing. One's coping style, which is defined as the thoughts and actions they use to manage stressful situations, has also been found to activate on the grief process. The ability to reframe problems to find something positive is a key aspect of the active emotional coping style, which, according to the literature, is the coping style associated with resiliency, which can thus lead to the best outcomes throughout the grief process. A person's cognitive style and whether they tend to think more optimistically or pessimistically also impacts grief. The optimistic style is related to active emotional coping in that the optimistic person is better able to find something positive in negative situations. This manner of thinking is associated with lower anxiety and depression during grieving, whereas those who have a more pessimistic outlook have a greater tendency to ruminate. Excessive rumination on feelings of sadness during bereavement have been implicated in the development of depression. Also, because the death of a loved one can challenge the assumptions a person has about the benevolence, fairness, and compassion of God, the spiritual adjustments inherent to task 3 of the grief process, if they're not adequately addressed, can lead to a spiritual crisis. And as we discussed earlier, one's self-esteem and self-confidence can also be challenged by the death of a loved one. While many people get an outpouring of love and support when they're initially faced with a loved one's death, Over time, it's not uncommon for that support to wane. This can leave the bereft person feeling isolated and forgotten. Some important factors that can help the grieving person are increasing their social integration by spending more time with others. This can involve creating new social roles, such as becoming a member of a support group or civic club, and becoming involved with community activities. Not only can other people in support groups help the bereft work through their feelings, the nature of support groups would also offer the bereft person a chance to help others who are grieving just like they are. This is another important factor for increasing one's sense of well-being. Likewise, connecting with religious and cultural organizations can help those in mourning work through their spiritually based challenges in ways that are more culturally meaningful for them. Perhaps the most troublesome challenge that occurs from somebody's death relates to changes in financial stability. The loss of income from a parent's death can leave the surviving spouse needing to take on extra work to support children. This can have a cascading effect in that child care needs may require that another adult or the older siblings step into the caregiver role, which in turn can affect those children's school performance. The unavailability of the surviving parent also can leave children feeling abandoned, which can increase their feelings of isolation, depression, anger, or resentment. For other people, such as elderly widows, the loss of income from their spouse can threaten their ability to afford to be able to remain in their home. So thanks for watching this presentation, and for more information on other topics regarding grief and bereavement, be sure to check out my other videos on YouTube. Thanks again.